They say it's a legend, just a story we tell kids, but I'm here to tell you not to believe a word of it. You would do well to beware the Yule Cat, no matter what they say. My cousins and I grew up in the Icelandic countryside and spent most of our lives within a stone's throw of our birthplace. For 2 weeks in December, my saintly grandmother would welcome us into her home so my parents could go Christmas shopping or have some time to themselves. She had all my cousins as well, a brood of 8 when we were all assembled, and we made quite a house full. Many nights after Granddad had made his excuses for going off to the pub, Grandma would gather us around the fire and tell us stories. Stories about fairies and Queen Mab and her ilk, and of the elves and darker things that had once been part of this landscape. She told us stories of Icelandic heroes and filled our dreams with monsters that begged to be slain as we took on our favorite champion's role. But especially around the Christmas season, her favorite story was of the Yule Cat.
He is a giant creature, capable of stepping over palisades and creeping into tall buildings. He punishes the lazy and rewards those who work hard and do their work year-round. If you neglect your duties, the Jólakaturin will find your children. Never doubt. His favorite meal is children without new clothes in the winter, their parents having spent their summers at leisure. Thankless children he hates as well, those who scorn their parents' work in favor of frivolous things. So be thankful, my children, that your parents work hard to keep such dark things away.
Most of her stories about the Yule Cat involved naughty children who went into the woods at night, spoiled children whose parents found that the Yule Cat had dragged them out through their window and gobbled them up, and good children who were rushing home on Christmas Eve to get their clothes before the Yule Cat got them. My little brother Sven always held a deep fear of the Yule Cat, but I can honestly never remember a time when I was afraid of him. It always just seemed kind of goofy to me, and in my head I just imagined a giant cat with big wobbly legs that looked like big noodles. Its body was high in the air, and the legs just wiggled around beneath it. I had drawn a picture of it for my grandma once, and she only smiled and ruffled my hair.
Let us hope that if Jólakaturin finds you, he is as silly as you think he is.
I had smiled about the idea of meeting the Yule Cat then, thinking of all the monsters and beasts my cousin and I had slain in our dreams. I'm not smiling as I write this, though. I came to live with my grandparents when I was 15. My father and mother had been killed in a car accident when a semi slid on the ice and hit them head on. They say they died instantly, but all I knew was that Sven and I were suddenly without parents. There was never any question of where we would go, of course. My grandmother opened her home to us without a second thought. With Grandpa 3 years in his grave, she said it would be nice to have some company, and we moved into her earthy little cottage. I lived with her until I was 23, attending university and getting my degree so I could begin a career in architecture. After graduation, I took up residence in my parents' old home so that I could maintain the family homestead. The house was on my grandparents' land, so it wasn't as though I never saw her again. Sven didn't like to go back to the old house, claiming that there were too many memories there, and my grandmother sheltered him quite a bit. When I moved back, I invited him to come live with me, but he declined. He was 17 and showed none of my ambition. I was worried that if he stayed, my grandmother would coddle him forever, but that was his decision to make. I moved back in around Christmas time, and I decorated my old house like it was my first Christmas ever. The lights and decorations were still in the crawl space, like they had always been, and as I put them up, I began to feel a heady sense of nostalgia. The tree stood in full view of the window, and I had bought enough presents for everyone this year. I had spent much of my life not having a lot of money, and now that I had a lucrative job, I decided to take advantage of the holiday season and spoil my relatives a bit. When I was done, my house had shone out against the darkness like a beacon. I was sitting snug by the fire, a cup of spiced hot chocolate in my hand and a slight buzz making my mind slippery, when the phone rang. My grandma's smiling picture showed from the home screen, and I picked it up as I tried to compose my voice. Grandma was used to people being a little drunk, but Granddad had been pickled more than he was sober during life, and I was still at that age where I was self-conscious about her seeing me like that. I answered the phone, and she immediately started with no greeting.
Care, you haven't come to get your Yule clothes. You need to come back now.
I wasn't used to my grandma being so forceful. She was usually very mild, content to smile and let others do what they would, but she seemed upset about this in an irrational way. Tomorrow was Christmas Day. All my cousins and my family and everyone would gather for presents at Grandma's before the usual feast. What Grandma was referring to was her tradition of giving us clothes to keep the Yule Cat away. This was my first Christmas away from home. I usually got them from Grandma when I woke up on the 23rd, but I guess I had missed it since I moved out. Oh, that's okay, Gran. I'll just get them tomorrow. I'll be there with the others. You can give them to me. No, you have to come get them now, and hurry. I need you here before the sun goes down, or the Yule Cat will get you. I had rolled my eyes at this. Gran, I think the Yule Cat will understand if I don't want to go out in the snow and get clothes. Can't I just get them tomorrow? Her voice went from severe matriarch to pleading older woman in the blink of an eye. Care, please. It's your first time away from home, and I want you to be safe. I can leave them on the porch if you don't want to come inside, but please come and get them. She sounded scared, and I couldn't argue. I told her I would get dressed and drive over before sunset, and she sighed in relief and thanked me. I dressed warmly in my snow pants and heavy coat. My muffler and gloves came on next, along with a pair of snow boots and a flashlight just in case. All of this went on over whatever I was already wearing, jeans and a t-shirt and thick socks, and I sighed forlornly as I stepped out in the ankle-deep snow. I put a hand on my old Jeep, but decided against it. My head was a little sloshy, and I knew it would only take a few minutes with the heat blasting before I was asleep and sliding on the icy road. Instead, I decided to walk to Grandmother's house, and it was only about 2 miles from here, in the bracing cold, which would sober me up before I got there. I set off towards the woods that separated her house from mine. Every time I walked those familiar trails, I always felt like I should be scattering breadcrumbs behind me. My grandmother's house lies sheltered in the woods, and they always feel so dense and foreboding whenever I have to walk through them. The snow and the cold made them quiet, the less hardy birds having left, and many of the other animals asleep for the winter. The tracks, however, told me that there were indeed things out here. My legs started to get tired almost at once. If you've never had to slog through deep snow, then I can tell you that it isn't much fun. As the sun began to set, I began to regret not taking the truck. I could hear the snow making the trees creak and sag, and now and again there was a scurry of movement as some small creature went about its business. Other than the occasional noise, it was as though I had the forest to myself, and my loud footsteps made me feel like the last person on Earth. When I heard the snow crunch nearby, I swung to see what was there. The sound had startled me. My own feet were the only thing making much noise out here, but I found nothing. By the sound of the crunch, I would have thought it was a reindeer, or maybe a large bird trying to forage below the snow. In the dim light, I couldn't even see where the prints were, and I started slogging a little faster, worried it might be a wild dog or something. The crunching came again, but I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me. When it crunched again, closer this time, I started moving even faster. Going too fast would be a great way to break an ankle or fall and impale myself on a tree limb, but the crunching and lack of a source was starting to freak me out. The snowing sky was already overcast, and the sun was setting behind me. The thought of being out here after dark made my skin crawl. The idea of getting lost in a stretch of wood that would become unnavigatable once the sun went down made me quicken my pace again. My footsteps were loud, cutting through the silence like a foghorn, but somehow I could still hear the steps behind me as I nearly jogged through the ankle-deep snow. What I had thought might be a reindeer or a wild dog now sounded like something much larger. It was very rare, but polar bears sometimes got stuck on ice floes and found their way over here. I had seen something online about it, I thought, and I could just see a big hungry polar bear loping behind me as it prepared to make a quick meal out of me. I didn't dare look back as I heard the crunch come down not 8 feet behind me. It hit the ground hard enough to dislodge snow from the trees, and I started booking it as best I could. What the hell was it? Iceland didn't have a lot of large predators, none that came this close to settled areas, and my mind began to travel back to a time when I was young and sitting warm around Grandma's fire. My cousins and I had always loved the stories about trolls and elves, stories of great heroes who slew the former and were aided by the latter, and we always took up sticks when we played and pretended to swing mighty swords at the knees of ugly, hulking trolls. The idea of being devoured by a large, slobbering troll, my mind showing me the one from Harry Potter, seemed less fun now that I was being chased by one through a fairy tale forest. I glanced behind me in a blind panic, not wanting to see, but wanting to know nonetheless, and I felt my boot sink into a hole. I went down, face first in the snow, and nearly head first onto a tree. I rolled over to face whatever was now surely going to get me, preparing to fight. My ancestors had been men who settled this land, men who rode onto the shores in boats with axes and tamed the wilderness, and I would be damned if I would die with my head in the snow like a blubbering baby. What I saw looming over me was no troll. What I saw looming over me was much, much worse. When I had drawn him, I had made his legs look like waving noodles. I had drawn him with a tabby cat coat and a pair of big, friendly yellow eyes. He had been given the Cheshire Cat's grin and a pair of pointy ears that made him look like Batman. He had looked friendly, goofy, something a child couldn't possibly be afraid of. The Yule Cat was none of those things. His coat was black as twice-baked charcoal, and his bones and muscles seemed to shift beneath it, like they might be something living under his skin. Its legs were long and powerful, like a panther or a jaguar, and its paws left tracks as big as hubcaps, with claws like stilettos. His mouth was filled with 2 big teeth, and the tips seemed to poke at his lips painfully as its slaver ran pink from his jaws. Its ears had been mostly chewed off, sitting on its head like rounded nubs that barely seemed big enough to be ears at all. Its eyes, though, its eyes were the worst. Its yellow eyes blazed like torches, their centers crackling red, and when it loosed a long, loud yowl, I felt my snow pants fill with piss. I was saved by sheer dumb luck. Its yowl had loosed some of the snow from the tree over its head, and when it fell, it coated the Yule Cat's face in a cold blanket of surprise. I rolled away, and when I did, the beast lunged at me. It ran smack into the tree I had nearly fallen into and yowled again. More snow fell on it then, and the cat hissed angrily as its claws shredded the tree to pieces. I didn't wait around to be the next scratching post for this thing. I ran through the snow like a reindeer, churning it up as my fear gave me new purpose. I could see the smoke from Grandma's chimney, but I knew I had to be another quarter of a mile from the house. The shadows were gathering, and I knew that I was dead as soon as this thing got its bearings. When it came after me, I realized it had only been playing with me before. Its crunching step sounded dinosauric, and it cleared the distance between us easily. It swiped at me as I ran, and the claws slid easily through my thick jacket. The back suddenly felt cold as the goose down spilled out of it, and I began to realize that I was running on borrowed time. I had to find some way to lose it. I had to find some way to use its size against it. I needed a place to hide and catch my breath, my lungs burning and my head swimming with exertion. That's when I passed the himmel tree and realized where I was. When we were children, there was a tall tree that we used as a landmark. We called it the himmel tree, the sky tree, because it always seemed like it soared up into the clouds. My older cousins and I had hiked to the tree once, nearly a quarter of a mile into the woods, and found that the tree lived up to its name. It was massive, 60 feet of wood like iron, and beneath it was a series of roots that looked like a cage. The soil had pushed away from them, and as kids we would crawl beneath the tree and camp in relative comfort. The spot was large for children, but would be snug for me. I was hoping that it would be too snug for this hellcat as well. I booked it, running flat out as the tree soared up to greet me. I jumped over a sprawl of fallen trees, something I remembered from childhood, and prayed that maybe the cat wouldn't be so lucky. When I heard him hiss and stumble a moment later, I knew that his luck had run out. I didn't look to see how badly he had spilled. I fell on my belly and prayed that I had the angle right as I slid between the roots of the huge tree. I thumped my shoulder, the tough old root hurting as I hit them, but I made it mostly under the tree as the cat scrambled after me. I winced as his claws caught my leg, ripping through my snow pants and jeans to sink into meat, but I shook him off before he could pull me out and was soon snug beneath the wooden canopy of the huge old tree. The underside was just as I remembered it. It was damp from snow run, but the frozen snow had mostly covered it, so I was left in a crystalline world of domed white. The cat screamed in agony, shooting a paw between the roots and searching for me in frustration. I huddled against the side of the tree, not wanting to be found by those furtive claws, and stayed as still and quiet as I could. The scrambling went on for some time, but the cat finally removed its sooty paw. I heard it crunching off into the forest then, lumbering away like a large black shadow as it disappeared into the woods. I stayed still, fearing some trick, but it went right on moving until its heavy footsteps were only slight crunches in the distance. I stayed put though, blowing on my hands as my wet pants and bleeding leg began to make me shiver. I would freeze to death out here if I stayed too long, but I was afraid that the Yule Cat might double back and wait for me to leave. I shivered for as long as I could, feeling the temperature drop as the sun crept closer to down. Finally, I decided I'd rather be eaten than freeze to death. I crawled out, and when I wasn't immediately set upon, I started stumbling towards my grandmother's house. She was waiting in the doorway for me, a mug of spiced cider in her hand, and a concerned grimace spread across her face. "He found you out there, didn't he?" It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. I've been sitting by the fire and letting her feed me and nurse me back to health for a few hours. She bandaged my leg and took my shredded clothes away. She set a plate of food in front of me, and when I finished the spiced cider, she brought me tea and told me to rest. Before she went back to her room to sleep, she dropped a package on my lap. It was a new sheepskin coat, lovely to see and soft to touch. I couldn't imagine what it had cost her, though I knew what it had almost cost me. "He won't bother you now," she said, and made her way to bed as I sat convulsing by the fire. So, heed your elders when they tell you the old stories. I was lucky, but you can't always count on luck. The Yule Cat still lurks in the hills and woods, searching for those he deems ungrateful and underdressed. Don't take the clothes you get for Christmas so lightly, because they could save your life if you find yourself in the sights of the Yule Cat.
Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story.
Hope you're enjoying our Christmas lineup. It should go right on through Christmas, so join us till the first of the year for many dark holiday tales. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our sponsors. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every YouTube and every TikTok video that I make. In this season of giving, come on down to Amazon. I'm sure you can find one of my books that'll fit someone on your wish list. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening and a spooky holiday season.